Before Steve Jobs became a symbol, before his name turned into a logo, before the world decided whether to worship him or criticize him, he was just a child who was given away. Not metaphorically, literally. Steve Jobs was adopted at birth. And even though his adoptive parents loved him deeply, that first wound stayed. Not consciously, but emotionally. Because when a child's earliest story begins with separation, a question quietly follows him for life. Am I wanted? He didn't grow up poor. He didn't grow up abused. But he grew up feeling different, not broken, just misaligned with the world around him. Pause. Steve was intelligent early, sharp, restless. He questioned authority instinctively, not out of rebellion for rebellion's sake, but because rules felt arbitrary to him. He didn't trust systems. He didn't trust institutions. He didn't trust people who asked him to conform without explaining why. At school, he was brilliant and difficult. Teachers didn't know what to do with him. Classmates didn't know how to place him. He wasn't trying to fit in. He was trying to breathe. And when the world doesn't give you space to breathe, you develop defenses. For Steve, that defense was certainty. He spoke with confidence before he earned it. He dismissed ideas quickly. He believed deeply in his own intuition because it was the only thing that never abandoned him. This is important, because what the world later called arrogance did not begin as ego, it began as protection. If you believe strongly enough in yourself, you don't have to ask anyone else for permission to exist. Long pause. As a teenager, Steve drifted further from the mainstream. He experimented with spirituality, with LSD, with Eastern philosophy, not because it was trendy, but because he was searching for coherence. He wanted the universe to make sense in a way that school never did. He dropped out of college, not because he failed, but because he refused to pay for a path that didn't feel true. And yet, he kept attending the classes that mattered to him. Calligraphy, design, form, things with no obvious payoff. At least not then. This tells you something. Steve wasn't chasing success. He was chasing resonance. He wanted things to feel right, even if no one else understood why. He slept on floors. He returned soda bottles for money. He lived lightly, almost as if he believed attachment itself was dangerous. And underneath all of it, the brilliance, the curiosity, the sharp edges, there was a quiet fear that if he ever stopped proving himself, the world might decide he was disposable after all. So he didn't stop. He pushed harder. He believed louder. He trusted his instincts with a near religious intensity. That intensity would soon create something extraordinary, and it would also plant the seeds of his greatest collapse. Pause. Because when success comes early to someone who hasn't yet learned humility, it doesn't heal insecurity. It disguises it. And that disguise can last for years. When Steve Jobs met Steve Wozniak, something aligned. Not personalities, purpose. Woz was the engineer, quiet, brilliant, happiest when solving problems no one saw. Jobs was the translator. He saw meaning where others saw circuitry. He saw destiny in a board full of wires. Together, they built something that felt almost accidental, a computer for people who didn't speak computer. Apple began in a garage, but that detail is often romanticized. What mattered more was not the location, but the belief. Steve believed they weren't building a product, they were correcting the universe. Pause. The Apple I worked. The Apple II exploded. Sales climbed. Attention followed. And Steve, still in his early 20s, suddenly found himself surrounded by adults who treated him like a prophet. Investors leaned in. Journalists listened closely. Rooms quieted when he spoke. This is dangerous. Not because success corrupts everyone, but because success removes friction. No one pushed back. No one said slow down. No one questioned his tone. They questioned themselves instead. Steve absorbed that environment quickly. His intuition had been validated, repeatedly. So he leaned into it, hard. He demanded excellence, relentlessly. He rejected ideas publicly. He humiliated employees in meetings, not because he enjoyed cruelty, but because he believed shame was an efficient filter. He divided people into categories, geniuses, and bozos. If you were on the wrong side, you felt it immediately. Long pause. This is where the myth starts to fracture. Because Steve didn't think he was being unreasonable. He thought he was being honest. He believed compromise diluted truth. He believed politeness wasted time. He believed if something was not perfect, it was wrong. And because Apple kept winning, no one forced him to confront the cost. The Macintosh project intensified everything. Steve didn't just want a great computer, he wanted immortality. He wanted to put a dent in the universe. He worked his team to exhaustion. He changed requirements midstream. He ignored budgets, ignored timelines, ignored warnings. And still, something magical emerged. The Macintosh launched, the crowd cheered, the bag was unveiled, history applauded, and Steve stood on stage convinced of one thing, that his way was not just effective, it was righteous. Pause. But organizations don't break when they fail. They break when success makes bad behavior untouchable. Apple was growing, fast, too fast for a founder who had never been taught how to share control. Steve saw executives as obstacles, boards as nuisances, processes as threats. He did not learn management, he dismissed it. And behind closed doors, tension grew. Whispers started, not about vision, about volatility, about fear, about sustainability. Steve Jobs was building the future, but burning the present. And the people who once protected him began asking a dangerous question. What happens if he never changes? Pause. Because when belief hardens into certainty, it stops listening. And when leadership stops listening, the fall is no longer a possibility. It becomes a schedule. By the mid-1980s, Apple was no longer a startup. It was a corporation. And corporations don't run on belief alone. They run on predictability, on trust, on leaders who can scale without tearing the structure apart. Steve Jobs had vision. No one questioned that. But vision is only half of leadership. The other half is restraint, and Steve had none. Inside Apple, friction became constant. Meetings were tense. Executives walked on eggshells. Ideas weren't debated. They were judged, publicly, harshly. Steve believed pressure revealed greatness. The board believed pressure was breaking people. John Sculley, the CEO Steve himself had recruited, stood at the center of the storm. At first, they were allies. Then they became opposites. Not enemies, something worse. Competitors for legitimacy. Steve saw Sculley as a salesman, a caretaker, someone who didn't feel the product. Sculley saw Steve as unstable, brilliant, but uncontrollable. And boards fear one thing above all else, uncontrollability. Pause. The Macintosh, Steve's emotional centerpiece, was struggling. Sales underperformed, costs were high. The market wasn't responding the way Steve expected. And for the first time, his intuition failed publicly. He didn't adjust, he doubled down. Blamed marketing, blamed timing, blamed misunderstanding, but never himself. Behind closed doors, the board deliberated, quietly, carefully. They didn't want to destroy Steve. They wanted to save Apple. And that is how tragedy often begins, with good intentions. In 1985, while Steve was away on a business trip, the board made its move. Authority was reassigned, power stripped, decisions rerouted. When Steve returned, the message was clear. He was no longer in charge. Not of the Macintosh, not of Apple, the company he founded, the company built in his parents' garage. Gone. Pause. This wasn't a firing in the traditional sense, no escort, no box of belongings, something colder. He was made irrelevant, in public. The press pounced, headlines mocked him, the boy wonder loses control, the visionary sidelined. People who once praised his genius now dissected his temperament. Silicon Valley whispered, he had it coming. Steve was 30 years old, and the world watched him fall. Long pause. He later said this was the most devastating experience of his life. Not because he lost a job, but because he lost identity. For years, Apple wasn't something he did. It was who he was, and now he was a founder without a company, a visionary without a platform, a prodigy without applause. He felt humiliated, angry, exposed. He considered leaving Silicon Valley entirely, starting over anonymously. Because when failure is public, it doesn't just hurt your confidence, it rewrites your self-image. Pause. Here's the part people skip. Steve did not suddenly become wise. He did not immediately grow humble. At first, he was bitter. He blamed the board, blamed Sculley, blamed short-term thinking, blamed everyone except the man in the mirror, because humility does not arrive when pain appears. It arrives when pain is processed. And Steve wasn't there yet. But something important had happened. For the first time in his life, belief was not enough. For the first time, the world said no and meant it. And that rejection would either destroy him or dismantle the parts of him that needed to die. After leaving Apple, Steve Jobs did not disappear. He retreated. There is a difference. Disappearing is giving up. Retreating is reloading, even if you don't yet know what you're reloading for. Steve was still young, still wealthy, still convinced the world had misunderstood him. So he did what many brilliant people do after public humiliation. He tried again. Immediately, he founded a new company and named it Next. The name itself was telling, not humble, not reflective, declarative. Next was meant to prove something, not to the market, to Apple, to the board, to everyone who had voted him out. This was not a second act, it was a rebuttal. Pause. The Next computer was beautiful, elegant, over-engineered, expensive. It was everything Steve loved, and almost everything customers didn't need. Sales were slow, margins were thin. The market didn't respond to purity of vision alone. Once again, Steve's instincts, unfiltered, unquestioned, ran into reality. But something was different this time. There was no applause to cushion the impact, no cheering crowd, no myth to hide behind, just numbers and silence. Next struggled. Years passed. The company survived, but it did not soar. And for the first time, Steve had to sit with something unfamiliar. Irrelevance. Pause. Around the same time, another venture quietly unfolded. Pixar. At first, it wasn't a movie studio. It was a hardware company. And it failed, again. Steve invested millions keeping it alive, not because it was profitable, because he believed in it. But belief alone wasn't enough anymore. Pixar forced Steve to collaborate, to trust people who were creative in ways he wasn't. Animators, storytellers, directors. He could not dominate them the way he once dominated engineers. If he tried, the work collapsed. So slowly, painfully, he changed his posture, not his ambition, his behavior. He learned to listen without immediately correcting, to allow ideas to breathe before judging them, to let others own outcomes. Toy Story succeeded, not because Steve controlled it, but because he didn't. Pause. This matters because Pixar did not teach Steve how to win. It taught him how to share victory. And sharing victory requires something ego resists: trust. At the same time, Next quietly pivoted from hardware to software, from ego-driven perfection to practical usefulness. Steve was still demanding, still intense, still difficult, but he was no longer deaf. Pain had done what praise never could. It had slowed him down, forced him inward, taught him that genius without humility creates beautiful disasters. Years later, Steve would reflect on this period and say, "Getting fired from Apple was the best thing that could have happened to me. Not because it felt good, but because it stripped him of certainty, of entitlement, of the illusion that talent alone was enough." Pause. This was not redemption yet. This was preparation, the kind you don't celebrate, the kind you endure. And while Steve rebuilt himself quietly, Apple, without him, was losing its way. The stage was being reset. The question was no longer whether Steve Jobs would return. The question was, would he return as the same man? By the mid-1990s, Apple was fading. Not dramatically, quietly. The kind of decline that doesn't make headlines until it's too late. Products multiplied, direction blurred, executives rotated. The company that once stood for clarity and rebellion now felt confused about its own identity. Inside Apple, people whispered a name: Steve. Not as nostalgia, as a last option. In 1996, Apple acquired Next. Officially, it was about software. Unofficially, it was about survival. And just like that, Steve Jobs walked back into the company that had removed him. But something was different. He didn't storm in. He didn't reclaim. He didn't announce dominance. He observed, listened, watched carefully, because this time, he knew how fragile power was. He accepted the title interim CEO, not because he lacked confidence, because he understood optics. And more importantly, he understood timing. Pause. Steve moved quickly, but not recklessly. He simplified, cut products, closed projects, not out of ego, but out of necessity. He removed noise, he removed confusion, he restored focus. And when he spoke to teams, they noticed a shift. The intensity was still there. The standards remained brutal, but the tone had changed. He still demanded excellence, but he listened. He still challenged ideas, but he asked questions first. This was not a softer Steve. It was a sharper one, refined by loss, grounded by consequence. Pause. Steve no longer needed to prove he was right. He needed Apple to work, and that distinction changed everything. He trusted people who earned it. He empowered leaders instead of dominating them. He stopped trying to control everything, not because he couldn't, because he finally understood what control cost. In meetings, he paused longer, interrupted less, and when he disagreed, he explained why, instead of humiliating. Employees felt it. They weren't less afraid, but they were more aligned. Fear had been replaced with clarity, and clarity scales. Pause. This was the version of Steve the world rarely talks about. Not the icon, not the tyrant, but the craftsman who had learned restraint. The leader who had been broken just enough to stop breaking others. Because leadership, at its highest level, is not about being obeyed. It's about being trusted under pressure. Steve Jobs came back not as a savior, but as a student who had finally learned what his first lesson cost. And now, with humility earned the hard way, he was ready to build again. When Steve Jobs finally stabilized Apple, he didn't rush to impress the world. He rebuilt the foundation first, quietly, decisively. He reduced Apple's product line from dozens to a handful, not because variety was bad, but because focus was sacred. Steve had learned something painful. Confusion kills companies faster than failure, so he drew a simple grid: consumer, professional, desktop, portable. That was it. Everything else, gone. People thought he was insane. Wall Street doubted him. Critics said Apple was shrinking itself into irrelevance. Steve didn't argue, he built. Pause. The iMac arrived, bright, playful, unapologetically different. It didn't try to win benchmarks, it tried to win hearts, and it worked. Not just commercially, emotionally. For the first time in years, people felt something looking at an Apple product. That feeling, that resonance, was Steve's true language. But this time, he wasn't speaking alone. Designers, engineers, marketers, they weren't being dominated, they were being aligned. Pause. Then came the iPod. Steve didn't invent digital music, he simplified it. He didn't create MP3 players, he made them humane. 1,000 songs in your pocket was not a spec, it was empathy. And empathy only emerges when ego steps aside. The iTunes ecosystem followed. Control, yes, but purposeful control. For the user, not for Steve. Pause. Then the iPhone. This was not an iteration. Steve stood on stage not as a boy genius hungry for validation, but as a craftsman confident in silence. He didn't oversell, he revealed. The audience didn't cheer because they were persuaded. They cheered because they understood. Technology had finally adapted to humans. Not the other way around. Pause. What people miss is this. The iPhone could not have been built by the Steve Jobs of 1984. That man was too rigid, too certain, too loud. The iPhone required patience, collaboration, taste. And taste, unlike intelligence, cannot be forced. It matures. Steve still pushed people, still demanded excellence, but now he pushed with purpose, not ego. He no longer needed credit, he needed coherence, because he had learned the hardest truth about greatness. Creation is not about expression, it's about service. Service to clarity, service to experience, service to something larger than the creator. Pause. Redemption does not arrive as applause, it arrives as alignment between who you are and what you build. Steve Jobs didn't come back to prove he was right. He came back to build something worthy of the pain that shaped him. And that difference, that invisible shift, changed the world. Near the end of his life, Steve Jobs spoke differently, slower, more deliberate. Not because he had less to say, but because he had learned that words carry weight only when they're restrained. Illness does that to a person. It strips urgency from performance. It leaves only meaning. Steve was not suddenly saintly. He was still demanding, still opinionated, still intense. But the sharpness, the need to dominate had softened, not out of kindness, out of understanding. Pause. He understood now what his younger self could not. That talent without humility does not scale. That vision without empathy isolates. That being right is not the same as being effective. Steve never denied his flaws. He acknowledged them plainly. He knew he hurt people. He knew his ego had cost him relationships. He knew his certainty had blinded him at times. But he also knew something else. Pain had taught him what praise never did. Pause. Being fired from Apple did not humble him immediately. It wounded him, and wounds take time to turn into wisdom. That space between injury and insight is where most people quit. Steve didn't. He stayed. He learned. He let failure sit with him long enough to change him. And that is the difference. Not everyone who suffers evolves. Only those who are willing to listen to the lesson. Pause. Steve once said that death was life's greatest invention, not because it ends things, but because it clarifies them. Near the end, he was no longer chasing legacy. He was protecting coherence between values and actions, between self and work, between creation and consequence. He no longer needed to be admired. He needed to be honest. And honesty, especially with yourself, is the most painful humility of all. Pause. If you are listening to this and you've been rejected publicly, embarrassingly, unfairly, understand this. Rejection does not ruin you. Refusal does not define you. But resistance to learning from it might. Steve Jobs was not great because he was flawless. He was great because he allowed failure to dismantle his ego without dismantling his will. He learned that humility is not weakness, it is precision. It removes noise. It sharpens judgment. It allows creation to serve something larger than the creator. Pause. So don't ask why life is humbling you. Ask what it's trying to remove. Because sometimes the most painful loss is the thing that makes your best work possible. Long pause. This was EP.9, fired from his own company. Not a story about being fired. A story about being rebuilt. From ego to clarity. From certainty to wisdom.